Well, thanks for joining us online this time around. Usually in the month of January, we always enjoy having our Face the State program focus on the Bureau of Business and Economic Research and talk about the big annual report. But of course, because of the pandemic and everything, we're going virtual, and we're going to talk a little bit about the whole presentation going virtual this year instead of having the traditional around the state tour that takes place. So we're very happy to have joining with us again this time around Patrick Barkey, the director of the Bureau of Business and Economic Research, and Tino Sonora, who's the associate director and especially focuses on, what was it you called it? Tino, it's an interesting side of this field. What'd you call it?
The macroeconomics, you mean?
Macroeconomics. I love that. We might ask you to explain a little bit and how that relates to Montana and the international economy. Well, let's jump in here and talk a little bit. I think it's interesting right off the top that the kind of one of the title of this that jumped out is Montana's economic hole shallower than the rest. And that is interesting because I think it looks forward and talks about rebounding. And Patrick, maybe you can explain a little bit of what are some of the sort of the top of shelf trends that you were most curious about going into this year's forecast.
Well, it's been just a remarkable year. It's been a year that our economic measures have really been overmatched by the speed and severity of events. That continues to be true today. The difference is that things are looking up a little bit more than they were going down, but nonetheless, we're always humbled when events actually occur because they're occurring at such speed. But I think that the top line trend is that we've been through a very severe and a very different kind of recession that is coincident with a public health crisis. It's left no part of the state untouched. And even if Montana's hole is indeed shallower than the rest, it remains a fairly formidable hole. And I would never, give anyone the conclusion that there hasn't been a great deal of pain suffered. That's certainly true. But we're future oriented, so we're trying to understand what's ahead. It's a difficult problem. It's always difficult. But right now, it's really everyone's focused on it. And so even though the pandemic has been pretty tough on us getting together and doing our usual community by community tour of the state, it's also sort of thrust people like myself and Tino into the limelight because people have so many questions.
Let's talk about that a little bit, Tino, when it comes to we've seen other economic downturns. Of course, the recession in 2008 and 9 and other things hit us before. Is this one tied perhaps even a little more so, and that recovery question, to those international markets and where we're going? Is there more global impact perhaps than we've seen in past downturns?
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah, it's been really interesting, actually. I mean, the global financial crisis obviously basically started in the United States and then spawned outwards. And then depending upon your level of global integration, it hit you harder or less hard. But this one has been basically has no prejudice, right? It's basically did something that's hit every country equally. It started in one place and then you could watch it sort of travel around the world, right? It had a little, airplane tickets from one country to the next. And initially, what its biggest issues were supply chain, and this is something that's affecting some industries right now. Is supply chain things again, as we're seeing these newer strains of the virus coming through. Some more lockdowns potentially. Definitely, I know in Europe they are, China, et cetera, et cetera. So that's affecting a lot of supply chain. So some of this is supply side related. Clearly, as the supply chains get shut down. And a lot of it is demand side, as we see people demanding less goods and services, as we see less demands for our goods and services, and couple that on top of the trade wars that have been going on for the past couple of years. So it's just sort of a compounding of a variety of different events. And then this one has just been that slow moving train wreck that we could see coming for quite some time, and still we're not prepared for it. And I think we've tried to kind of be reactive when in times maybe economics wise and health wise we probably should be a little bit more proactive.
It seems to me too that this is one of the first. I mean, we've had some, but this seems like a real significant challenge to the so-called global economy. I mean, we've seen the growth of this over the last 30 or 40 years even, but this is the first real test of those systems, like you mentioned, supply side, tariff, all those things. Would that be a fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, the last big pandemic the world had, which was the flu pandemic, of course, of 1918, 1919, the world wasn't nearly as integrated as it is today. So clearly, that has had those kind of impacts, is that movement of not only goods and services, but also financial assets, as well as labor and capital movements across the globe are a lot more integrated today than they were 100 years ago. So it definitely has had that sort of longer lasting, more global impact, which affects us here in Montana and the United States in general.
Patrick, when we look at this, then we talk about that whole. We're in January here of 2021. How certain or uncertain are we when we look and we say, well, how long will it take to come out of the hole for Montana? Are there just a lot of different things to kind of calculate here, or are we seeing some things that you can pretty much put a pin in?
Calculation's not the problem. The problem is surprise and being able to see into the future. I can answer that question with an example, Dennis, and that is to give you some feel for how much forecasts have changed. So, for example, in December, obviously, of 2019, there was no forecast of a recession. That's been the case for most recessions. They surprise us. Then we got into April and May, and people were looking at huge declines, which actually did show up in the data, huge declines in jobs, huge spikes in unemployment, and the forecasts became very, very ugly. We were talking about way into 2023 before we caught up with the pre-recession trend of the economy. And then you got into December, and vaccines were becoming available, and it looked like there was going to be a little bit more regularity in our near future. And those forecasts have improved remarkably, whereas some forecasts are saying that even by the end of midpoint of next year, we'll be back up to a trend. I'm not saying any of those forecasts are right or wrong, but look how much they've changed just in a few months' time. So I think you have to be prepared, as anyone running a business or an organization, you have to be prepared for change in terms of our assessment. The one constant in this whole experience has been surprise. I think many of those have been positive surprises recently, but the magnitude of them should make us take pause when we really try to lock in our plans for the future.
One of the things that you've written in here is, and I'll do a quote, is talking about this reflection on 2020. And you write, COVID's icy grip left no corner of the state's cities and regions untouched, yet it has unfolded in a way that has little resemblance to previous economic downturns. Kind of explain that assessment a little bit. Is it because of these uncertainties and the unexpected that's kind of got us into this situation?
Well, the first part of that is simply, if you look around the state and you want to say, well, who around the state did a good job with this? Who came through unscathed? I mean, there's the story of the Great Recession. Well, it looked like Eastern Montana actually did okay then because of oil and so forth. These kinds of stories. This particular experience has none of those. Every single part of the state. So Bozeman, fastest growing part of the state, they had a huge hit. Everywhere, slow trajectory, fast trajectory. Even communities that were already in some sort of economic distress, nobody was spared this. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of being very different, and I think we could fill up several hours talking about this, but the shock to the economic system didn't come because consumers and businesses were afraid to buy. They didn't look and say, "Oh my God, I don't have the resources I thought I would have. I'm going to cut back my plans." Instead, it was they were prevented from buying, either from this kind of supply side disruptions Tina was talking about, but really more importantly, I would argue, although supply side is super important, on the consumer side, particularly the services that require personal contact were ones that were ruled off the table, either legally or socially. Either we were told we couldn't do them or we didn't want to do them to begin with. So that's unlike anything we've experienced in recent history.
When we'll talk a little bit about some of these bright spots in a second, but I noticed that you're talking about, say, Flathead, Missoula, Yellowstone specifically, those counties kind of still seeing faster than average growth. Was that really happening even with the challenges, or was it sort of tied to specific sectors that were sort of lifting all boats, so to speak?
Well, there's a lot of dynamics in those particular communities that cause them to be on a different trajectory. But just to be clear, they all suffered a big hit. The question is, how are we going to grow coming out of this? And our expectation is that the growth in those areas you just mentioned, plus maybe a few others that aren't fully formed metro areas like Ravalli County or Madison County outside of Bozeman, our expectation is that those will have a faster trajectory of growth when we get into the more solidified growth stage after 21, really, but even going into 21. So there's lots of reasons for that, and we've dwelled on those in some programs, but their drivers are hitting on their more cylinders in their engine, if you will, and fewer basic core challenges like some of the slower growing parts of the state have.
How about places like, say, Great Falls, Cascade County, Helena, Lewis and Clark, of course, Butte, Silverbow, sort of those, economic markets that have always just kind of chugged through no matter what's happened in the state of Montana over the last 100+ years?
Well, they all have different stories. I'll be really quick. I mean, Helena as a government town is one that we expect to do pretty well. In fact, we're more optimistic about Helena now than we have been in years past. And a lot of that has to do with the government role. I mean, there's been a lot of money coming into Montana, and that's really helped stabilize the economy. And a lot of it has gone through government. So that's, but they have had a slower trajectory of growth. Great Falls and Butte Silverbow, I mean, all three of the areas you mentioned, but particularly the Great Falls and Butte Silverbow have had more challenges in terms of retaining their population, some unfavorable population trends there, particularly in Great Falls, where they've had some difficulty retaining their younger workers. I mean, it's a strong and vibrant economy in Great Falls, but relative to the other parts of the state, they've had more trouble there.
Tino, when we look at so some of these bright spots, let's dive into this for a minute. And first off, taking a look at kind of that big picture for the global and national kinds of trends, are we seeing any correlation between what we saw, say, specific, bright spots in Montana versus what we saw on a larger market picture?
Well, I think, kind of what Pat was also alluding to is there's a lot of sectoral differences. And so various sectors are getting hit harder than others. So a place like Missoula or Helena, which is a government town, I mean, those are pretty constant. Missoula, Bozeman have big universities, which kind of help smooth some of these shocks. Has a relatively diverse economy. So a more diverse economy obviously can weather these kinds of shocks a lot better than a less well-developed. So if you looked at some place which is smaller, like say, even Flathead, which is more tourism growth related, they're going to take some hits. However, they can kind of counterbalance that with some of that in-migration that they're getting from non-residents moving into the region who want to retire or whatever. So that's going to help kind of balance some of these negative shocks out. In terms of international, I mean, we're seeing the same things internationally and nationally that we would, Montana's no different. We're not immune. I think where places like Montana or, any wild Western state, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, where we're benefiting is from tourism that maybe people might have gone somewhere outside of the country, but now they're having to stay inside of the country. So that's kind of helped counterbalance some of that. Certainly, we experience the same kinds of issues with these sectoral things. So, recreation, hospitality, and leisure. These kinds of sectors are getting hit, but that's happening globally. And so, I don't think we're any different, but we can maybe benefit from some of that substitution away from international travel. We're not going to go to Paris this year, so we're going to go to Montana. That kind of stuff is going on, and I think that's helping us maybe have a little bit of a shallower decline than some other places, but it's still pretty extreme. And again, that's going to be, dependent on what fraction of your total output is based in any given sector. If that sector gets hit, even a small amount might really impact your economy. Whereas a big shock to a really small sector will have relatively little effect on your economy. So I think that's kind of explaining some of those, not only sort of statewide or regional differences, but even at the county level as well.
Patrick, I remember us all talking last spring, and I mean, the tourism industry in particular, it was like all the alarm bells were going off. We were in lockdown, there's state quarantines, all kinds of things. I mean, I think one of the most astonishing parts of this, and certainly it was not the year we all wanted, but was how we really saw once some of those travel restrictions came off, how that rebounded. I mean, that was pretty astonishing. What do the numbers though really show?
Well, we're still trying to sort it out. I'll tell you, there's certainly, all Montanans are by their very nature monitors of the tourism industry because we drive the roads, right? Mm-hmm. So when the roads fill up, we go, yep, well, we know what's going on. But really drives the tourism industry, of course, is the capacity of the tourism industry, and parts of the tourism industry did shut down in anticipation of a bad year, but also the spending. And I'm not raining on anybody's parade. I've been pleasantly surprised, just as everyone else has, at how strong that backfill that Tino was mentioning of folks who might have flown here, but now they drove, et cetera, how strong that was. And yet, when you look at some of the data, for example, when you look at the credit card records that are available that detail consumer spending in Montana by broad category, they still say that spending in restaurants and hotels in Montana is 42% down. And so when you put that together, the way I put it together, and I don't necessarily have the answer, but the way I rationalize is that we have tourists, yes, but they don't spend like tourists have in the past. When they drive here, well, they don't really need the same kinds of hotels, whatever. I mean, we're still trying to get a handle on that. So it was better than we expected, but not a great year.
I'm glad you said that, because that was what, and your colleagues across campus there, the folks that research tourism, have told me much the same thing. They said they're here, the campgrounds are full, but you're not necessarily seeing that ripple through all of the services that we normally might expect. And I guess that's to be expected, considering that we still had a lot of restrictions and people were still nervous. I think you talked about fear the other day when we talked about this.
Yeah, exactly. And so really and one of our speakers at our program, Ed Glazer from Harvard, is really at the forefront of talking about this. And that is and his comment is, when you take something that we used to value, which is personal interaction and communications and synergies, exchange of knowledge, even just the mere act of a smile when we hand you a coffee across the counter, when that kind of interaction becomes something that's potentially deadly, then that just changes the whole equation for so many of those service industries that employ so many of us.
And if I may, Dennis, just kind of
go ahead,
back on that a little bit, is that, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of economists have taken advantage of a lot of data that's become recently available. So a lot of cell phone data, mobility data. And I was looking at some of this mobility data, and you could sort of correlate mobility data with some of these state imposed restrictions. But there's also a fraction of that that's related to human behavior that Pat was talking about. And we're actually, I was trying to do a little back of the envelope calculation kind of stuff, but I'm finding that in the recent times, over the past, I don't know, say 2 or 6 weeks or so, a lot of the declines in people going out is not necessarily because of restrictions, it's because of behavior. And it's that, what Pat was saying, a smile might kill you kind of thing, or I don't want to put my hands on the glass of the ice cream thing or whatever. And that's kind of, I think that's one of those big unknowns that we're going to be facing, is how are people's behavior is going to change. The vaccine will obviously change some of this, create some optimism. But then we got these new variants that are coming online now, which I think could, freak a little bit of people out. And so that's going to be one of those, unknown unknowns that known unknowns that we have to deal with.
Well, and really, you talk about the behavior. I mean, I found myself, and I love to get out and take long drives and explore. People know that. But I found myself, we'd say, well, let's pack, food to go, or let's stop the grocery store once as opposed to stopping at several locations. So yeah, behavior, and we'll get back to how some of that might linger as we go along. Tino, I want to ask you just quick, because we always touch on healthcare. It's a big part of the industry and economy here in Montana. How do we forecast this data with so much of that healthcare in flux? And what's kind of a quick thumbnail of where we're at there?
Well, I mean, as I'm sure everybody knows, healthcare is one of the fastest growing sectors in the economy. We have an aging population. We have more and more healthcare. I think the rural healthcare is going to be a very big deal. But I think in healthcare, what's particularly exciting in Montana now is, especially for smaller communities, is a lot more of this e-healthcare, healthcare over the internet and stuff, kind of provision, providing healthcare to other areas. The healthcare industry in Montana, I think, and nationally as well, took kind of a dive in the initial few months. It's recovered pretty well. I would say that all of the cities are back, or all the bigger sort of health center towns are back in terms of their employment and output in terms of healthcare, but they're back pretty strong. I mean, it was a bit of a decline, but it is coming back. People are revisiting the hospitals, and so that's a positive sign. Again, I think it depended. Cascade, you mentioned Great Falls earlier. Great Falls, I mean, they've taken a really big hit in terms of this COVID, so they're kind of strapped, right? Missoula is on the other hand, has been relatively well. So our hospitals aren't as full. So I think again, it's literally county by county, town by town, even hospital by hospital kind of level kind of data that's going on and what we're seeing in employment as well as output.
It's been fascinating to watch especially the smaller hospitals, just have a renaissance, a growth of telemedicine, and that'll be an interesting track as we go through this year. Patrick, when we talk about the CARES Act funding and the stimulus money, how much assistance did that really give us? Did it really shore up the economy, or are we able to parse that out of this data?
Oh, you can't help but parse it out of the data, Dennis. I mean, you trip over it. It was a gigantic impact on the economy. I can't tell you how different a year it has been for those of us who watch the data. I mean, Tino, I don't know if you ever thought you were going to live through a quarter when the economy declined at 34% annualized rate. I mean, who ever heard of that? And at the same time, when you look at the money that came into the state from the CARES Act, it really solidified income, both for consumers and for businesses. And what it really did in a nutshell is it provided a floor in aggregate, not for every household, unfortunately, but it provided a floor such that income, when you look at money measures of the economy of Montana in 2020, a year where we had all these incredible off-the-scale economic events, when you look at money measures for income, it does not look like that bad of a year. I hesitate. I can see the fruit being thrown at people's computer screens as I say this. Now, jobs, no question about it. Okay, so and I think you can trace that right to the CARES Act. I think there's some other things involved there as well, but there's several things about the CARES Act that aren't really well understood by Montanans. One, for example, is that the distributions that were made to state governments were per capita. Okay, so larger states got more, smaller states got less. But thank God for the 50 member Senate. There was a floor. So Montana got $2.5 billion. If we would have gotten that per capita, we would have been down about $1 billion less. So we actually got more than our fair share here in Montana in some of those distributions. So that's getting into the weeds a little bit, Dennis, but that act was it was unprecedented how quickly Congress moved. Everyone said that we couldn't agree on anything. Well, we agreed on that, and we agreed on it relatively quickly. And were there excesses? Was there graft? Was there things that we're not proud of in terms of money being spent here and there and places that didn't need it? Of course, but I would argue that the act itself was really a testimony to effective action that the likes of which, quite frankly, many of us didn't think Congress could do anymore. But it was well done, and it really helped.
Let's talk about this surge in real estate. If I see one more Zoomtown headline, I'm going to pass out. I think I'm getting a little tired of all that speculation. But what do the numbers really tell us? Now, if I talk, and we've had conversations with, the realtors and that side of the industry, the housing industry, really talking about, hey, all these people came in and did this and did that. What do the numbers, though, at the end of the year and looking ahead into 2021 really tell us about how that really is shaped up, Patrick?
Well, you got to come to our program, Dennis. We'll have a whole segment on that. And Tino is a more recent house home purchaser than I am, but I'll tell you just a couple of things. Okay, The first point is that we've been in the midst of what I would call an underbuilding in housing markets, particularly in the West and particularly in places like Missoula and Bozeman, Flathead, even River Valley. We've been in the midst of that for going on 20 years. So we come into this in a situation of low inventory. We throw everything dealing with real estate a curveball. And when I say everything, we lowered interest rates. We all of a sudden made everybody reevaluate their demand for housing across the country. And you put that juice into demand with those low inventories, and we've had some price spikes, no question about it. The questions going forward, and these are the ones we're going to try to take on in our program. The questions going forward is, what does this mean for the future? Does this mean that we just accelerated a bunch of purchases that were going to happen already, and everyone piled in year 2020, and or is this something that's going to be more lasting? And then, of course, the other side is how's the supply side going to react? Are we going to continue to see the sort of glacial building in markets like Missoula and Western Montana, and then not to pick on Missoula, but lots of markets? And if so, then we're really on that trend for demand exceeding supply.
And if I'm sorry if I could too. I mean, it also depends on what's being built. I mean, there's a lot of high income housing being built at the cost of very low, not much low income housing. And I think that was a lesson that came out of the financial crisis. It was better to put all your eggs into high value homes rather than low value homes. So I think a lot of what's going on, and this is another reason to come to our seminar, because we'll be discussing affordable housing, is just that. There's almost, I don't want to say an oversupply, but a relative oversupply of upper income types of housing compared to lower income housing.
Because I can remember doing stories, I'm saying 5-6 years ago, and you would look at the trend, and there was a lot of inventory. Builders were still building the 400, 450, 500, 550 type homes. And at the time, a lot of realtors were telling me privately, say, we really don't need those. We need these median price houses. And it seems like this has been kind of an exaggeration of some of those kinds of trends that we're jumping. And now will this have more of a long range impact? And I guess that's what we watch going forward, right?
Right. And that's obviously going to have an impact on low income housing too, because now there's a supply shortage, if you will, of lower starter homes. And so those prices are going to get driven up. And so people who are just starting out are going to have a harder and harder time just buying a 2-bedroom, 1,200 square foot house,
And it gets in, and this is a funny conversation to have in Montana, but I certainly saw it in Washington. It really is about land inventory as well, isn't it, Patrick? I mean, a lot of
buildable land, right? I mean,
that's a huge part of this, isn't it?
The big difference between now and let's say in the middle of the housing boom in the mid 2000s is the supply of buildable lots. Mm-hmm. It's a tiny fraction of what it was back then. Now, I think though that what we're talking about here is a problem where we still have not recognized why the problem exists. So we took this on in a BBER program, a very popular BBER program. We took this problem on a couple of years ago. And as much as we would like to say that we can solve a problem with a BBER program, we didn't solve it. We just pointed out what the problems were. And really, without meaningfully impacting the supply side of the marketplace, the problems are going to fester. People like to live in the West. We're a destination. Idaho's a destination. The whole Western Mountain West, some people refer to as the third coast. Mm-hmm. People from California think we're affordable. Guess what? They want to buy here. You know what that does?
Well, it seems to me too that there's some tech trends that are really just on the verge of blowing up. I mean, everything from solar and alternative power sources being more affordable, more operational, easier to use, getting people to live maybe on the edge of the grid, if not off the grid, but then also internet access. I mean, Elon Musk putting up these Starlink access sites. I mean, it seems like there's a lot that, Tino, we're kind of watching that could really be interesting over the next 5 to 10 years and how that affects all that, right?
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, and we talked about telemedicine a little bit earlier, but that's the same thing. we could almost become there's no need to work where you live in many cases. And again, Montana is a little bit is not as advantage. We're actually about the last state in terms of telecommutability, if you will, meaning that we have the lowest percentage of jobs which can actually be telecommuting. But certainly we can import people from all over the world, really. I mean, it's not limited to just the United States. And so yes, I think that's going to be something that we're going to have to keep an eye on, definitely over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And it's going to change a lot. It's not just going to be an economic change. It's going to be a social change, a cultural change, all of these kinds of things. It's something that, other states that might be a little bit ahead of Montana have already kind of dealing with, but I think it is something that's coming.
I mean, it's fascinating. My son lives now in the Bitterroot, moved up from Salt Lake. He's working for a firm in Vancouver, BC, living in the Bitterroot. My daughter-in-law, she does animation. She's working animation for a company in Japan, and they're living in Stevensville. And I'm like, how does that work? That's fascinating. Hey, a couple of quick points here before we wrap up. Let's talk about some of our traditional greatest hits, if you will, really quickly. Patrick, tell me a little bit about timber. I've read anecdotally that people were staying home doing all these fix it up and DIY projects, and of course we talked about housing demand. How has our timber industry sort of navigated this generally?
Well, I mean, the seismic event in the wood products industry has been the run up in lumber prices. That's incredible. There's been some supply chain issues involved there. There was a huge run up in the summer. It went down, and prices are right back up again. So, I mean, we're talking about giant, several orders of magnitude increases in prices. One thing for our part of the world, and more specifically Montana, is that we no longer have the mill capacity here to really tap into that very much. And yet there could be worse problems to have as a wood products industry than to see the price of your product sky high. Why that is it's a mixture of what we've already been talking about, but it does have to do with the changing nature of housing demand, the fact that people do have money, and people actually have time, and they're spending a lot more time in their homes using them in ways they hadn't used them in the past. Again, going forward, the question is, what's this mean for the future? Have we cashed in on 3 years worth of projects and shoved them all into 2020 because this is the time to do it? Or is this something that's bringing us up to a higher plateau? So I think there's been some interest. There's been some change of ownership with respect to some of the forest lands, the privately owned harvestable forest lands that shows I think there's some staying power, and finally we're seeing some divestment of Montana and Northwestern based timber companies. They're starting to diversify and buy up places in the South where more supply exists.
And Tina, when we talk about manufacturing, you touched on this earlier, but specifically inside Montana, a little bit of a stall in some of our manufacturing. And was that really tied to those supply side problems?
I mean, nationally, that seems to be the case. Certainly, and maybe some of the tariffs are playing a role as well on some of our imports. But certainly, I think the supply chain is being hurt. And again, it does depend on what sector of the economy you're in. Even if you're in food, are you in the restaurant business or are you in the food production business? And so even those two, which seemingly seem very, are the same sectors, they're really not. So it really is dependent upon some of these supply chain issues. I know that I was just reading an article today about, 27 ships are off in LA Harbor just circling around because there's no place for them to park and there's no one to unload them. And so it's these kinds of probably, hopefully short run types of shocks, which are going to have an impact. And I think what it's doing now is forcing a lot of manufacturers who rely on imported inputs to their production or for export to reevaluate just in fact, how they approach those markets, what their supply chain is going to look like. Is manufacturing Helena going to look towards Bozeman or look towards Vancouver? These kinds of things. And so I think that's going to play a role. I mean, and that's the main stall, I think. But again, it's compounded. It's hard to extract what is COVID related, what is tariff related, what is just, globalization related. these kinds of things. Competition related, maybe some inputs can go to Mexico or can go to Peru instead. So it's a whole bunch of stuff rolled together. But I suspect that's a lot of it.
Sort of a stay tuned for the next chapter kind of year for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is one of there's a lot of these questions we'll know and the real answer to in like 5 years. So.
Yeah, exactly. Patrick, final question for you on this, and we'll talk about the program. But we've talked about restaurants, and I think in that general hospitality industry, but especially the restaurants, eateries, who really have been riding a roller coaster of regulations and controls, and can you serve and can't you serve. One thing I've been interested to see is how they've innovated. That's been interesting. But where are they at, and how? What's kind of your sketch of where they may be going as we come out of this?
Well, I mean, that's an industry that's been throwing a big curveball. One of the things that we're all doing now is we are enjoying our own cooking these days, and I suspect that many American households, many Montana households, are just pining for the days to get back out. So, in terms of being a long trend of is the future for restaurants right now pretty tough? Well, of course. But in the future, I expect that we're a relatively affluent society. Restaurants have always been highly valued, so they're going to come back. Here's the problem, Dennis, is that it might not be the same ones. The capacity of some of these businesses to continue was already stretched very thin. The CARES Act helped. The new restrictions didn't. So I think there's unfortunately, every recession has some has losses. Jobs don't continue, businesses don't continue, and it's hard to prevent. I think a lot of government actions have helped. A few, I won't go too much further than that. A few haven't, but downturns are tough, and this one has had their name on the center of the bullseye, and so. I think we're going to see some familiar restaurants not make it. Some of them have already failed, but demand will be back, and the ability of our economy to reorganize and to reboot and rebound, if you will, remains strong. And I think their prospects, as long as we can get out of the morass we're in now, are relatively bright. But right now, not so much.
Let's talk about the program that's coming up on February 1st and 2nd, going virtual this year. Tino, was it harder to prepare